Hello and welcome to Breaking Embargo. I'm Peter Barnes. That's Steven Barrett. Let's get into it. Steven, thank you ever so much for joining us. It's been absolutely brilliant to have you. You're one of my favourite commentators at the moment. You genuinely are, and we've worked together a little bit too much, I would say, these days. But we were literally just saying off camera that we don't see each other in person anymore, but we've got to try and fix that. But, you know, one thing I've always loved about you, Steven, is your love of the law is very infectious. Like, the way that you talk about it is very accessible, and I think that is what we need more of. I genuinely, no matter what expertise area we're talking about, like, too many people hide behind complexity and they hide behind grandiose titles and all the rest of it. I've always liked how you say, like, no, this is for everybody and everybody should understand this. And I was just really, where does that really come from? That kind of ability to break down a very complex thing, to explain it, but not to patronize, because that is a very difficult thing to do.
Well, that's very kind if I do achieve that. That is what I am aiming for, and I put an awful lot of effort into that. I hope I achieve it, but it's certainly not something that I take for granted or assume that I can do. The love of the law really comes from my experiences growing up as a child. So I was a very poor child, or a relatively poor child, and you don't get any sort of, life's not necessarily kind to you. There's no softness to it. And I learned pretty early on that grown-ups will abuse rules. And I remember particularly once a teacher sending me to stand outside the classroom for being rude. And I just remember standing outside the classroom thinking, what on earth did I actually say or do that was allegedly rude? And I just couldn't work it out. And I to this day, I strongly suspect that the teacher was, whatever, hungover, had a bad day, just grumpy, wanted somebody to shout at. And I learned that there is humans will apply rules in an arbitrary way and then pretend that they aren't. Humans lie. And this has perturbed me for most of my life. And that's why I really started to go into law, because I wanted to know what the rules were. And then I could make sure that that didn't happen. And it's partly what I'm doing in society in general. I have a child now, and I want my child to grow up in a better world than the one I grew up in. I think most parents feel that. And I think clear rules are a path to that. I'm very politically opposed, not in a party way, but just politically opposed to the types of people who don't like laws, because I think laws and rules help you. And the example I always like to give is that if you get invited to a wedding. Okay, so let's talk about this absolutely honestly. As a wedding guest, that's quite a nervous thing to be. Most of us going to a wedding are quite nervous because it's not going to be a group of your mates down the pub. It's a whole mix of people that the couple.
Yeah, there's going to be a great aunt and a granny somewhere, and you've got to. Are you dressed correctly? That's a bit like there's a lot of things that could go wrong.
This is the point, Pete. That if you're already stressed, and if that wedding invitation says something like "smart casual" or "wear what you like," that is a mental. That is a crisis for you. That is horrendous. Yeah. I can't think of anything worse. I actually think that's a form of torturing a fellow human. If you do that, wear whatever you like. No judgment. It's like there's going to be judgment.
That's really what Guantanamo Bay was. It was everybody getting invitations with smart casual, and that was and everybody panicking, going like, "What do I wear?"
And I think we need to talk about this. So if you instead receive a wedding invitation that says lounge suit, you know exactly what to wear.
Agree.
Stress has gone. Yeah. You've still got the stress of the event, but you have de-stressed, you have de-escalated the situation. And that's what I think rules do. And there's a very clear, and they've been culturally dominant, if not always politically dominant for the last 30 years, a very clear group of people who don't understand or agree with that. I suppose I should be humble, and I might be wrong. I might, it might not be that everybody benefits from clear rules, but I think we do. But they don't like rules. And they think rules are somehow inherently evil. Like they actually think that just telling, like, don't if you tell a child what to do or what not to do, they think that you're somehow hurting the child.
Yes.
Which
Yeah.
is absolutely not true. And I'm more than happy to go on record, Pete, as saying that we've had very clear rules while I've been raising my child on my own from birth. And we reminisced last year about the last time I told my child off, and my child then was about 8 or 9. And the last time I actually had to tell my child off was when they were 3.5. You don't, because the rules are known. You're not going to get.
Yeah.
I don't do that. The one thing I won't do is that arbitrary thing that teacher did to me of you've been rude and just
yes, yeah. Lack of specificity.
yeah, we have clear rules, and if you break a rule, then of course there will have to be you have to be told off. But if you don't break a rule, you don't get told off. And again, that I think has led to a much more joyful childhood. So I don't see how these rules have in any way hurt my child. I think that they've benefited because they exist. We almost don't need to think about them. It's like fences and walls and doors keep you safe. They're not oppressing you. I have dogs, and I don't actually cage train because my beagle is so mad that the beagle will destroy any cage you put her in. But I inherently don't mind the idea of cages, and there are people who have dogs who think that that's somehow absolutely oppressive. And it's like, well, hang on a second. You have your dog in the living room. That's got walls. Why is that? Why is one set of walls better than another? And it's true that rules can be used to oppress. It's true that you can have awful rules, but in a democracy, you tend not to get them. And what's really been going on for the last 30 years is that the people who've been in charge don't think that that's what a democracy would produce. So people who are culturally empowered, like Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart, politically, they don't really seem to believe in democracy. They think that the people are stupid, and that if you let them vote, they will put people in power who will make awful and oppressive laws. Ergo, you shouldn't let people vote. And actually, I just think that that's wrong. I think you're much more likely to get sensible decisions from group decision making. There's been a very interesting study, Pete, that says that, and the first bit won't surprise you, but if you take one adult and you ask them to make a decision when they're sober, most of the time they make a reasonable and safe decision. If you ask the same adult to make a decision when they're drunk, they tend to make proportionally worse decisions and choices. No surprise. If you ask a group of adults to make decisions, they make reasonable, while they're sober, they make reasonable decisions. And if you do the same while they're drunk, the group of adults still proportionally makes more reasonable decisions. There is something, and the Persian Empire knew this, because famously before Alexander the Great came, the Persian court, if it was going to do something dramatic, if the emperor wanted to do something dramatic, he would ask his nobles for advice. Very good way to not get killed, by the way. Even dictators.
You knew.
Even dictators have to be a little bit, inclusive. Which Keir Starmer, if you're watching this, that's a top tip for you. But and the Persian court would take the decision, rationalize it, and then they'd all get drunk and see if they still agreed with the idea.
Yes, yeah, I have heard that before, and I do often think it's not a bad idea, but then I've seen most of Parliament drunk. And I still think they sometimes often make the wrong ideas. It might be the anomaly that proves the rule is the British Parliament, if I'm being honest.
Well, the problem with the British Parliament is it doesnthis is
what I wanted to come on to, because one thing I completely agree with you. I deal more with the kind of the policy aspect of it, trying to get things done. And obviously you look at this from the legal perspective, but I can't help but feel that at times our law is written by a 4-year-old on a sugar high. Like, it has no clarity, no focus. It is distracted by every shiny object they've ever seen in their life. And yet we've put them in charge of something incredibly important. And I kind of feel like a lot of the problems that we have are self-inflicted because of this fundamental root problem. And I was just, where do we kind of get to grips with it? What can we really do to kind of hook back in and really ground ourselves in a kind of, look, this is what the purpose of it is. This is how we measure it. This is how we regulate it. And this is how we will then re-regulate if something goes wrong. The kind of step-by-step process that most businesses probably operate under. Our laws just don't do that. Where's it gone wrong? And sorry, Stephen, how do we fix it?
Well, it has gone wrong because it's not, I don't even think it's trying anymore, to be perfectly honest.
It's not even trying.
It adopted an EU style of drafting.
Mm.
And I saw yesterday from an academic who's very pro EU. So please never think I'm taking a position on Brexit. I hate the fact that the people, it's not people like you and me. It tends to be the generation above us that has some sort of mad sectarian. You've just taken a position on Brexit. And I'm like, oh,
yeah.
But anyway,
I do just as an aside, I do wish we'd rather leave that where it was. Like, don't get me wrong, you can still very clearly divvy people up on their other aspects of politics, but I don't distrust somebody because they happen to vote Remain in 2016. Like, I distrust them because of what they did yesterday. Like, there's other reasons not to like people, and I always think if the Brexit one is the one you root it in, you're not trying hard enough. If you really don't want to like someone.
Well, a great mate of mine is what's called a Jean Monnet academic, which means that his job, and that's an EU appointed professor, and he only gets his money from the EU, and obviously he's not. You don't get to get those jobs if you're anti-EU, and he's not.
A major point of the European funding is you don't badmouth them. So how can you say it's just incredible to me?
Well, he doesn't dislike them, but he has written a highly critical book about their failings. And it's like, if you love something, you can still notice its failures.
Yes.
I don't know why British politics descended into this bizarre cult-like situation.
The false dichotomy argument is the noose around our neck. It really is. Honestly, sorry, we've got sidetracked. So, like the law, let's stick with the law before we try and fix the rest of the world's problems.
So that's what's going on. That's what's going on with Parliament. So they're still drafting like the EU draft, and it is wordy and it is too complicated. They're not trying to make laws that are clear. In the old days, so going back a few decades now, well, quite a few decades, they would publish bills in the Times. So somebody would sit around their table, or the Sunday Times, sit around their table, and the public would read the proposed text. And the public would sit there going, that's stupid, I shall write to my MP. And the public would engage. Now, I've never seen a bill published in a way that is designed to attract public attention.
No.
And it should do. That's what I mean about the wisdom of collective decision making. We have to get us all back involved in the process. We need to stop having these things called specialist parliamentary council who think they are the experts in writing law because they're writing absolute garbage. They're writing far too many words. And I'm not just going to single them out for criticism. I think the judges have also gone mad. Giving them Microsoft Word was far too much of an indulgence. In the old days...
It should have been an extra sketch.
Well, in the old days, they used to share secretaries. So first of all, they'd have to write their judgments by hand. And these are old men and women. So, they're not going to go on for ages and ages. Secondly, if they give the secretary 80 pages, she's going to go, I've got time to do that. It's just we think about these things, but they are constitutional checks and balances. Far more, it's become so common now to see the Constitution as a legal thing. But actually, sometimes the Constitution is just a heavily practical thing. And the other one that we used to do to judges, which is really important, is we used to make them read the judgment out in court. So if they do a 500-page judgment, they're going to be there for 14 days. And that stops them doing it.
In a way, I enjoy that. Sorry, I don't know how delightfully British that is. But also, it deeply concerns me that we basically ran the country on the idea that old men didn't want to do anything for a very long time. But however, it did seem to work.
It does work. And you have to build simplicity into the system. And you have to try for simplicity. Because as I said at the start, I put an awful lot of effort into trying to be simple. It would be so much easier for me to just waffle on like every other lawyer does. And I get every other lawyer on social media seems to think that the public needs to be told absolutely every minutiae about everything. And they're not even trying to simplify it. I see them write a 64 tweet thread and it's like, nobody is reading 64 tweets. Okay, they're not.
And the people that are probably part of a bigger problem of the kind of, I know a lot of politics, and then it kind of puts people off engaging in politics. Actually, I actually think I often say this about people like myself are the worst people to talk about politics with, because my experience of it is in the bubble looking out. Yours is out the bubble looking in. We might be looking at the same thing, but we're looking in two different directions. So our understandings are very different. We're using the same words, maybe, but we're not meaning the same thing. And I think that is a huge problem. Particularly, I'm not a lawyer by trade, but I tell you now, I deal with a lot of them. And you're like one of the 3 that I like. So yes, but what I'm saying, my point is, yeah. Sorry, go on.
Well, they're making
my point,
a good living out of all of this, so
yeah,
there is an
yeah.
incentive for it to carry on.
That's the point. Yeah, it was like you're hiding behind complexity, often to kind of mask either the fact that you don't really know what you're talking about, which in the political world is a big problem. I imagine in the legal world it definitely is, but also you're doing it to, I think, in a way, push people away from it so they won't question some of the aspects that are very problematic in our law. Like, they will hate the idea of this conversation,
Yes,
and people watching it.
I deeply upset them for some bizarre reason.
Yes,
Now,
I have to admit, yeah, that is terrible. Actually, some of the things that have happened and the things that people have said for you professionally, I think it's a disgrace to the profession. If I'm being brutally honest, Stephen, I think you've been treated terribly.
well, that's very kind. I just KBO. But the EU use complexity because it's a union of, it used to be 28 member states. They're all pretty pulling in different directions. They've all got national bases. It's very hard for the EU to keep all the cats in the sack and going in the same direction. So I have a lot of sympathy for why the EU use complexity. I just don't think it's a way that we should run ourselves. I think we should go back to having simple and clear laws. We should, by the way, the point about the judge having to read the judgment was really proved in the Four Women Scotland case, the one where the judges only needed to do a single line, which is that a man is a man and a woman is a woman. But they waffled on for so long that Lord Hodge sat, when he read it, he said, the case is too long for me to read. The judgment is too long for me to read. So I will read a summary. It's like, you've just admitted a constitutional
the one I do
understanding and complaining. If you're a non-lawyer and you don't understand the law, well, that's not your job to understand the law. So it's the fault of the law, not you.
Yes,
and
agreed.
Let's go back to that.
Yeah, because I remember the one example I had was I was working as a lobbyist at the time, and I was dealing with the Brexit rulings. Do you know when the Supreme Court kind of got its moment in the sun? And they read out the decisions, and then literally everybody turned to me and said, "What does that mean?" Like, I was just thinking, I'm like, you've just watched the same thing I have. And I mean, I kind of speak Westminster, obviously, but that was a whole other ball game, and I think it was a prime example, like you say, of this, hiding behind it, over complexity, just making it vastly complex for the sake of it. But I do think the problem we're seeing now, and you bring up Starmer, is the weaponization of the law and the vagueness of it. The law is vague. Often it can be an advantage, but it can be used in a very nefarious way. It can be used in a way that it was never intended. And it seems to me that often, because of the politics of things, there's no real buffers to stop that now. This idea of Parliament as a kind of accountability chamber doesn't exist for me. It's a show. It's a pantomime at best. It's a cheap drag act most of the time. But I think there's a real problem there. And particularly with Starmer, obviously being a human rights lawyer, DPP and all this nonsense. Dad's a tool maker, you don't say. But there's that element of it. But what's Starmer's roots in this? He's not the kind of illness, he's a symptom. So what give me your thoughts, Stephen.
So it's back to that same idea. They don't want clear rules because they think rules are oppressive, and they want to stay in power even when they're not winning elections. And that's why they devised the human rights regime. As we've all noticed by now, the human rights regime does not exist to protect any normal people, and it doesn't work for any normal people. Where is Lucy Connolly's right to freedom of speech? It's nowhere. These human rights only exist for those who are privileged enough to get expensive lawyers working for them for free, and those expensive lawyers are quite clearly doing that in a political way. And Strasbourg itself, the human rights court that we pay for, the Belgians have just criticised it today, saying it just makes stuff up. And the more people who say this, the happier I'll be, because it does just make stuff up. I find real law, which is the consistent application of rules, very comforting and mentally comforting. As I said, clear rules like, wear a lounge suit to the wedding, mentally comforting. But vague laws are tyranny. That's what they are. And really, let's start to see the Human Rights Act for what it is. It's not really law, because it just takes everything back to absolute basics. It's not. I think of it like coding. proper law should be applying one rule and then another rule and then another rule, and then you get this great chain of rules, and then you get to whatever the modern problem is, because the modern problems in law shouldn't be basic, they shouldn't be obvious or low grade, they should be complicated because we're a sophisticated society. Human Rights Act does away with all of that and just goes, oh, it's a right to family life. Oh, my kid doesn't like chicken nuggets in Turkey. You know what? How do I deal with it? That's not law.
For me, the way you've described that, it's the kind of the tyranny of the abstract, but with simplicity. So therefore, like, what it's talking about, seems really simple, but because it's so abstract, it's actually incredibly complicated. So therefore, it could be applied, disapplied. It could be used in a way that it was probably not meant to be used. So I suppose is that the kind of point? Have I got that right?
Yes, because I think that there are a group of people in our society who are not well, and who I don't trust, and I think are actually bad people. And I think you identify the bad people in one very simple way. They will argue this. They will argue it's not happening, and anyway it's a good thing, which is an admission that the first line was a lie. But they don't care about lying. They don't feel wedded to the truth. This is the war on truth.
Yes,
they
the war
don't
on
feel
truth.
committed to it at all. But the rest of us who are basically decent people can be manipulated and shoved around by these monsters. And I think it's about time we started calling them out. If we go back to simplicity in our society, if we demand it, if we engage with politics again and our MPs, we get MPs reading the text that they write.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got an alert on statutory instruments, so I like to sort of keep an eye on them as they're made, and they pop up on Twitter, so I get told them. And one came the other day, and I literally couldn't understand anything it said, because all it said was, this will amend section blah 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 of this act. And so then I'm like, oh, okay, I'll cut and paste Google, right, got it, and it just said, which will amend section blah 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 of this act.
Oh God, yeah.
And I literally went through this process 7 times.
That's why I look this old.
I just gave up. I'm just like, I don't know what the hell they've done. Well, they got no idea.
Yeah,
and
it's ridiculous.
That's not a way to live. This is our country, and they are our laws. And I feel deeply committed. You know, it's the George Washington retirement speech, which is beautifully done in Hamilton, but is genuinely what he wrote for his retirement. And he quoted the Psalm, which is that his ideal was the benign influence of the benign influence of good laws under a free government. That was the ever favored object of his heart. And it's like, that is good laws and a free government and safety, so that none of us can have the rozzers knock on our door at 4 a.m. for a tweet. I think we'd all like to go back to that, to be perfect.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, you rage against the war on truth pretty much every time we're ever on TV. This seems to be our thing. And but I think people don't really get just how important it is. And I do think that the Supreme Court's ruling on the transgender issue, I think, is a prime example of an assault on truth. Because the lack of consistency I see in these kind of lobby groups and these special interest groups on every aspect of this issue is staggering to me. And the fact that they feel empowered enough to keep saying these inconsistencies, and nobody calls them out on it. Their own side also doesn't call them out on it. I think that is a big problem. The right has that problem as well when it comes to things like reform and Nigel Farage and the issues that creates. But on that Supreme Court ruling, I listened to most of the commentary, and I'm like, well, none of you know what's actually in the thing. None of you know why it's existed. Most of you think it's only been going for about a year. This thing has been going on for over a decade. Like, you know, this is a big, important question. And people always say, like, why do you always fuss about the trans issue? Because it is about truth. And it's about there's just that one word, and about why it is so important that we have the truth as the bedrock. And, you know, the number of people that think that doesn't matter, I find concerning.
So there is a good show at the moment on Disney Plus, and it's the Star Wars franchise, and it's called Andor. And I'm finding it deeply entertaining, because obviously all culture is now in the hands of lefties, because they've basically marched through the institutions and they control everything. And famously, Disney is destroying itself with some of the woke rubbish it's producing. But Andor is lovely in the way that it's not woke, but it's also hilarious in that they're talking about the start of the rebellion, and they don't seem to understand that they're talking about now. And they don't seem to understand that the woke people are the empire, that Emperor Palpatine is them, and
Yes.
and that the rebels are us. But there are two.
Yeah.
I flag this up to your listeners and viewers because there are two. Well, there's a number of really great speeches in Andor, and that's really the point of watching it. It's back to sort of almost Greek theatre again, when you just sit there for ages and then you get a fantastic speech. And there's one at the end of season 1 about the need. We've been sleeping, and this has been going on. Our freedoms have been taken away without us paying any attention, and we need to wake up. And that's a absolutely fabulous speech, and that could not be more true of now. We all need to wake up. We all need to politically engage. We must stop being children. I know it's been comforting. I know it's been easier, but it's lazy, and the bad people will abuse it.
The infantilization of the nation will go down as one of the biggest problems and the worst things that we've ever done. We aren't children. We have to deal with complexity.
No.
Yeah.
Yes, and we've been here before, and Churchill kept faith with the British people in the 30s, because back then they were saying exactly what they say now. They were saying the young men won't fight for the country, nobody wants to do this, what's wrong with Mr. Hitler? And all of these arguments were going on and on and on. And Churchill was just like, no, I think that they're asleep, but they're still Britain. And and that's what I don't consider myself better than Churchill. So I'm going to assume.
There's a solid rule.
I'm going to hope that we are still Britain. But the second speech, which is only very recently given by Mon Mothma in the Senate, is that it's absolutely brilliant line. The gap between what is true and what we speak about is now an abyss. And that's where they were when they were falling into the tyranny of an emperor who's going to take away all their freedom and march them into, a quasi-fascist state. And that's where we are. So we really need to just get back to truth. Start saying the truth if you know it's true, even if you worry about what might happen to you, because you just have to. And I'm going to do my own podcast tomorrow with Amy Gallagher, who's the nurse
Oh yes. I was on talk with Kevin O'Sullivan, and she was a guest. Brilliant. The resilience marvelous. Of that woman is just incredible.
Well, if she can do it, then we can all do it. And we can all just stand with truth and stay there. And the other great phrase I'd like us to get back is, it's a free country. So if somebody says, you can't say that, it's a free country, because we should be a free country. We're not, but we're only going to get it back if we fight for it. And that's the point the point I continue to make. We pulled it out of the fight, so what did we expect was going to happen? And to fix it, we don't just have to carp about it, we have to do something. And like you said, re-engaging, I think, is the core thing we can all do. Yes, it's dealing with some terrible people, and it's it can seem like so much is going on all the time, and to a degree that is done deliberately, as we've said, but things are complicated. But these kind of spoon feeding that we've got going on at the minute of, here comes the aeroplane. This is what we're doing today. That mentality has to go away. And until we do that, I think you're bang on that this assault on truth is going to continue, and it will get worse. It's not going to get better. It is going to get worse. And the one, to use a similar kind of TV narrative analogy, is always, I like it in I think it's the Mitchell and Webb look, where they're both dressed as SS soldiers, and they go, are we the baddies? Because, they don't have skull and crossbones on their uniforms. Are we the bad guys in this? It's a brilliant moment of kind of, how did nobody realize what was going on? And I always go back, but I have to admit, I am an Andor fan, and I haven't seen the second season yet. So, thank you, Steven. Honestly, this has been brilliant. It's one of the reasons you're one of my favorite commentators, one of my favorite people. Thank you so much. Please, I'm going to leave all of Steven's the Substack and all his details below. Please do go check him out. He does a great little thing on a Friday where he answers questions, and trust me, I need them answering as well. So it's brilliant. Again, Steven, thank you so much indeed, and please do join us next time.